This video will provide an overview on how to replace hardware in and around the engine bay of a Porsche 944. The Porsche 944 features a variety of metric nuts, bolts, screws, and washers used to assemble the engine, as well as secure the numerous brackets, clamps, and fittings found in the engine bay. As you're working on your car, it's fairly common to find that some of this hardware has gone missing over the years. Given the varying degrees of disassembly and reassembly these cars go through as they're passed on to each subsequent owner. In many cases, exposure to the elements also takes its toll on the metal, causing significant oxidation throughout, so replacing some of this hardware may end up on your list of restoration tasks. Let's take a minute to talk about metric nut and bolt specifications. Metric fasteners are commonly referenced using M sizes, for example M6, M8, M10, but the size of a metric bolt is more accurately specified using the diameter, pitch, and length dimensions in millimeters. For nuts, the size dimensions are simply diameter and pitch. Here's an example of a metric bolt specification, M8-1.0 by 30, and that can be broken down as follows. The letter M indicates that this bolt uses a metric thread. The number 8 refers to the diameter of the bolt shaft in millimeters. The number 1.0 is the thread pitch of the bolt, which is the distance between the threads in millimeters. And the final figure 30 is the bolt length in millimeters, measured from the base of the head to the end of the shaft. It's also quite common to see metric bolts specified like this example, M10-40, and in these cases, the abbreviated format omits the pitch definition. Whenever the pitch dimension is omitted from a metric bolt specification, the bolt will be considered coarse-threaded, provided that it's labeled correctly. So in this example, the M10-40 bolt has a diameter of 10 millimeters and a length of 40 millimeters. Most of the bolts on the 944 use a standard coarse thread, but there are a few that use the fine-threaded pitch, and those details can sometimes be found in the Porsche parts catalog. One example that comes to mind where the specifications aren't correctly listed is the M12 by 65 millimeter bolts for the front bumper, which are actually a 1.5 millimeter fine thread pitch. Similarly, most of the metric nuts on the 944 use a standard pitch as well, with just a few exceptions that use a fine pitch, such as the M8 nuts used to secure the throttle cam and the cruise control servo actuator. Wrench sizing is another item of note when working with metric fasteners, and since nuts and bolts aren't usually labeled for tool size, a specification chart can be used to identify the needed hardware. Here's a list of standard spanner and Allen key sizes that apply to the most commonly used metric nuts and bolts, where we can see, for example, that M6 bolts use a 10mm wrench, M8 bolts use a 13mm wrench, and so on. Additional considerations when replacing fasteners include the strength of the bolt material, or the grade, as well as partially threaded versus fully threaded bolts. Generally speaking, most of the bolts around the engine bay are a standard class 8.8 steel that is yellow zinc plated. There are a few applications like the bolts on the steering shaft, for instance, that use hardened class 10.9 steel with a higher tensile strength. The bolt grade isn't usually listed in the parts catalog, but that specification is stamped on the top of the bolt heads for reference. When working on the 944, you'll also find some fasteners that are only partially threaded, and these are best for applications requiring high resistance and close-fitting alignment when joining components together, so those should always be replaced with the same partially threaded bolts. Now that you're ready to replace some hardware on the car, there are a few different paths you can take. Let's say, for example, that you're planning to replace the car's timing belt and you'd like to add some new hardware to the plastic belt covers while you're in there. What you can do is navigate to that section of the parts catalog and see that the covers are secured by some bolts and washers labeled as numbers 12 and 13 on the diagram. Well, you can then scroll down to the part sheet for those numbers and see that some M6 by 12mm bolts are used, along with some Form A 6.4mm washers, which are standard M6 washers. When we look over to the quantity column on the right-hand side of the sheet, it shows that we'll need to order 11 bolts and washers for this setup. This method is pretty spot on for most of the components on the car, with only a few exceptions, and those tend to occur with some of the parts that were significantly changed between the early and the later cars. One example is the alternator mounting bracket that was updated on the 944, where I found that the bolt lengths in the parts catalog didn't match the hardware installed on my later car. Another consideration is for things like the bounce shaft housing hardware, where there are a few changes over the years, and the remarks column on the part sheet can be referenced to ensure you're looking at the correct model year for your car. Outside of the parts catalog, you could also simply remove the bolts from the car and measure both the diameter and the length of the bolt shank to determine the required specifications. Once you've identified what you need, the part numbers in the parts catalog can then be used to order replacement hardware from any of the Porsche parts vendors. You can also save some money by purchasing new hardware from a dedicated fastener vendor like bellmetric.com, which will serve most of the hardware found on the 944, unless the bolt length is unusual, like the 58mm bolts found on the later balance shaft housing design, and in those cases you have to go directly through Porsche, but there aren't too many of those. As we navigate the Bellmetric website, we'll see there are various categories for the bolts, nuts, and washers, so it's pretty easy to track down what you need. As for the belt cover hardware we were looking at, all we need to do is click on bolts and then select the grade, in this case 8.8 hex bolts. We then have the option to select the bolt diameter, which will be M6, and we're looking for 12mm length, full threaded in yellow zinc, and we can update the quantity and so on. As we scroll down here, we'll also find the thread pitch listed in the specifications, which can be useful. Next, we'll need some M6 washers, and we can see there are a number of different washer options, but these will just be the flat washers, and the HV140 steel will work fine. Select the size and the desired plating, and if we scroll down here, we can see the inner diameter specification of 6.4mm, as we noted in the parts catalog. Once you've placed your order and the new hardware arrives, you can match it up to the old hardware, and if everything looks the same, it can be installed on the car, and you can start to enjoy some freshly plated steel fasteners.